Welcome to Soundstage Insider, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the film and television industry. We're bringing you the visionary directors and producers, the talented cinematographers, editors, sound designers, and more who really make the magic happen. We delve deep into their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. So let's go beyond the red carpet and discover a fascinating world of behind-the-scenes talent. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Soundstage Insider, the podcast that takes you behind the curtain of the film and television industry. I'm your host, Jamie Mufett, and today we have an extraordinary treat for you. Get ready to dive into the world of music, composition, and scoring as we sit down with the brilliant and versatile artist, Kris Bowers. Kris Bowers, an American composer and pianist, has been captivating audiences with his compositions for over 10 years. From scoring films like the critically acclaimed Green Book and King Richard, to his work on television series such as Bridgerton, Mrs. America, and the groundbreaking Dear White People and When They See Us, Bowers has become a force to be reckoned with in the industry. Kris's new project, Anthem, released on Hulu on June 28th, is a musical journey across the US, in an attempt to reimagine the national anthem. Kris Bowers' talent has garnered him a Daytime Emmy Award for his work on Amazon Prime's adaptation of The Snowy Day, as well as multiple nominations at the Primetime Creative Arts Emmy Awards, Grammy Awards, and Critics' Choice Awards. Bowers' remarkable contributions to the industry were further highlighted when he received an Academy Award nomination for co-directing the captivating documentary short A Concerto is a Conversation. Collaborating with icons like Jay-Z, Kanye West, and Jose James, and his friendship with Aretha Franklin, and yes, we talk about that in the interview, Bowers has continually pushed boundaries and crafted an extraordinary musical legacy. We kick off the interview with me asking Kris how he got started in musical composition for film and TV.
There were actually kind of a few starts. When I was in college, I had scored a couple of shorts by a friend of mine, and very, very small, minimal amount of music. Like one was just the end credits, and one was like a short little doc that she had done. And then the first kind of more professional thing I did was a documentary about Elaine Stritch and the Broadway actress. And that happened primarily because my manager at the time, this woman who was my manager for a few years after I won the Monk competition, she was friends with the director. And I talked so much about film scoring that she was like, I want to get you your first film scoring job. And they wanted a jazz score for that movie. And I just won this jazz competition. So it kind of worked out pretty perfectly. And so I did that. And then I did another documentary that director produced. But then I didn't do anything for a little while. And then I scored a documentary about Kobe Bryant. And I feel like that's the one that I count as really getting my career started, because ever since then I've been fully in this career and in this industry. And that came from a friend of mine who I knew in a high school all-star jazz band. And I talked so much about film scoring, and he remembered that. And so he came up to me after a show of mine and asked me if I would score this documentary about Kobe that he was producing. But that really led to like a number of other documentaries and the Sundance Composers Lab and like some of my first big projects. So, yeah.
That's very interesting. And is working behind the scenes attractive particularly versus being a performer and being like the sort of face of the thing, or is it just creatively you were drawn to film and TV?
I mean, it's a bit of both. I mean, even as a performer, I liked being a pianist because you could be an accompanist a lot, and then also at times kind of come out in the front. And so I liked that my malleability of where I was in terms of like being seen on the stage. And then there was really a passion for film scoring because of how much music was and still is an emotional vehicle for me. So for me, the piano was a way to express emotions that I couldn't express verbally in as clear of a way. And that's what attracted me to film scoring, was this idea of translating emotion into music. And so I wanted to get into it ever since I was a kid.
Is there a visual component to your creativity too, even though you're just doing the music part? Is that inspirational too? Is that a big part of it?
Yeah, there's something really visceral that happens when I'm absorbing something visually, and again, trying to express that. The best way I can express that is through music. But I find even writing music outside of film music, it's often helpful for me to have visuals that I'm reacting to. So I'll either find a painting or some like screenshots from a movie or things like that, just because it sets a very clear tone that I can, meditate on and then just kind of express musically.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So let's talk about the very early stages of a project. I'm fascinated about what that first, or how you pick your projects, I guess, is the first stage. Are you sent opportunities? Do you put your name forward for things? How does it work?
Yeah, these days I'm sent things, and oftentimes from the creators that I've been, establishing a relationship with and a connection with. And so for me, I feel fortunate that a lot of the collaborators I've been working with are continuing to grow in their careers or are pretty established in their careers. And so I'm not needing to go look for work as much as just for them to have the next thing that they have going on and hopefully be a part of that. And even with that, I'm still wanting to make sure it's something that creates a visceral reaction in me emotionally. And so I'm just responding to whatever I'm reading, if they send me the script, or whatever I'm watching, and hoping that it has something that really goes deep into the psyche of a character, or creates this world that's really complex and interesting. But for me, the complexity of both characters and worlds that are built, I think, are the things that make me feel most drawn to the projects I work on.
And is it always a script, or do you ever get other visual medium, or are you brought in partway through a project and then you've got more to go on in terms of, the vibe of the thing?
Yeah, it really varies. So at times it's a script, sometimes it's a first cut, like they just finished filming and they have the first assembly cut put together and I watch that. Sometimes it's while they're filming and they have some like dailies they can send me. And then there are even times where they're pretty much done with the edit and I'm coming in with, a few weeks left. And so I always prefer the earlier part of the process, but they have come in on a wide range of stages.
And so you mentioned sort of a gut reaction, right, to whatever it is, the script or the media. Is it purely that? Is that what piques your interest? Just a pure creative spark that comes from reading a script or watching something that gets you interested in the project?
Yeah, and the people involved. I think that when I often will go to the work that they've worked on before, if we haven't worked together already, and see if that's something that feels the way that I like, my content or my media to feel. And so if I watch their shows or their movies they've worked on in the past, or I realize I've already seen those things and really love them, that also helps. There are definitely times where I read a script or get, a log line about something and that sounds super interesting. And then I kind of look at the team that's putting it together and that kind of makes me feel like, oh, maybe I don't want to be a part of it. So
it's funny, as I interview people for this podcast more and more, I'm discovering that who you're working with is becoming more and more relevant for people than, as much, if not more so, than the creative itself, because it's a big time investment and, you have to spend a lot of time with these people. So working with cool people is, a big part of the decision, right?
Yeah, definitely. And you're also, the best version of this collaborative process is generating a lot of moments of vulnerability. And so you also have people that you feel okay being vulnerable with. You feel like that everybody is doing that on the same level, or that, your process of doing that is being supported, or that they're holding space for that part of the process. So I think that, there have been a couple of times where I've gone through that process of being really vulnerable, working on something, and the collaborators maybe didn't provide an environment that made me feel like that was worth doing, and so definitely being mindful of whether or not I feel like this potential collaborator will kind of create that environment that feels like it's worth going there, because that feels like that creates the best work when we're able to go there.
Well, speaking to that, actually, that sort of pragmatic and creative side, that's almost like a constant clash in this world, right, between finance and practicality, and then it's ultimately incredibly creative and inspirational, this kind of stuff. So do you have separate parts of your brain that are sort of battling each other, or are you able to sort of put yourself in one mode in a certain meeting and another mode in a certain environment? How do you sort of juggle those two things?
Yeah, I definitely am working to be more conscious of where my mind is naturally going in terms of those, different sides. And then also at the same time, what's necessary for the moment. I think in every phase of the process, even in the creative process, there's so many times where I want my mind to fully be in the exploratory, generative, like creative space, and not in the editorial organizational space. And so trying to separate those so that I give myself space to play and not think about whether or not this is going to work or whether or not this is the right idea or any of that. And then once I have something to react to, then I go more to the organizational side of my mind and figure out how to structure it or if it's going to make sense. And it's definitely difficult, but I try my best to be aware of those two sides and push myself in either direction when it feels like it's necessary. And then, like you were saying, I think in the process of this industry, there definitely is a back and forth of like having conversations that are much more about creative and like, open sky, like just kind of throwing paint at the wall type of conversations, and then conversations that are about like, okay, well, how are we going to get this done? Like, what's the schedule? Is like, all of that kind of, I actually thrive. I love both parts of those, mental processes. So for me, it's fun to kind of live in both, but it definitely is tough to separate them. And I try to be mindful of that.
Yeah, very cool. So I was looking through your IMDb, which is really extensive. You've worked a ton over the last, 10 plus years, 10, 15 years. Your signature style, if that is the way to describe it, is very eclectic. You're working across genres, styles, eras, everything. It's a sort of two-part question, I guess. Do you feel you have a signature composing style? And if not, do you feel that eclecticism is what people are drawn to when they want to work with you?
Yeah, I definitely think that it seems like the latter is true. I think that that's what I appreciate about the collaborators I've worked with, because, there are a lot of projects that kind of go all over the place, genre-wise or style-wise, but a lot of repeat collaborators. Someone like Ray Green, who I'm working with right now on a Bob Marley movie, and we just did King Richard together. That's very different, stylistic.
Yeah.
Working with Shonda Rhimes on For the People and Bridgerton, very stylistically different, or Ava on When They See Us and DMZ. So I think that I feel lucky that the collaborators I work with are often exploring different spaces, and they trust me to go into those different spaces with them. And for me, I think that that's part of what made me excited about being a composer in this space versus being a performer, is that I could one day write this kind of music, one day go explore this kind of music. And I'm always studying and learning and growing as a musician by just with the nature of exploring those different genres. And then as far as like a style, I don't know about a style. I think for me, the thing that probably exists across the board is hopefully, strong attention to detail when it comes to thematic material, whether it's melodic or a palette, something that thematically is really intentional. And then my harmonic and rhythmic language, I think, is something that exists across the board that, I just love. With my jazz background, just more complex harmonies, or harmonies that kind of feel like they come from that space. And same rhythmically, like I love music that I can dance to. I love like, the pop and like hip hop music that I grew up with. And so I think that also exists in a lot of the projects I work on too.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned jazz, then it struck me that jazz is quite a good jumping off point, right, for a lot of genres, because a lot of genres have sort of spawned from jazz. So your experience in that world and love for that world gives you that eclecticism. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I totally agree.
So what is your relationship? I'd like to know what the relationship is like between a composer and a director or a showrunner or something like that. Is there a formula for that? Like, how would you describe that relationship for someone that doesn't work in that world and people listening who don't know what that would be like?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing is helping this director, filmmaker, showrunner to feel comfortable having a conversation about an art form that they might not know very much about. And for me, the exciting part is translating their thoughts and emotional desires for their project into music. And, sometimes that can be relatively easy if they feel like they have some sort of clarity with music, whether it's references that they feel very strongly about, and they can talk about why this piece of music makes them feel a certain way, or they're very clear with instruments that make them feel a certain way. But other times it's the composer's job to try and find a way to get that information out. There are times where I'm working with a director and I write a piece of music and he or she will say, oh, that didn't really make me feel this way that I'm trying to feel. And then I'll ask questions about I'll ask questions to try to get at whether or not it's something about the instrumentation, something about the pace of the music. Is there another piece of music that makes them feel that way? And if so, can we talk about that instrumentation, that tempo? And oftentimes I'll find that with those conversations, it becomes clearer that, oh, for this director, the sound of piano immediately means nostalgia, or this director, the sound of piano immediately means melodramatic and not what they want, or for this project that this director's working on, they want a sound that's unplaceable, and for this director, they want like a very traditional sound. So I think having those conversations to try to develop a shorthand and also clarity on what it is we're saying about the palette, without needing to talk about it too much, because then we can get to the point where we're just talking emotionally. Like, I love the process of talking to a director about what they want emotionally and them trusting me to go interpret that musically. But in order to get there, I feel like you have to get on the same page with what does nostalgia sound like? What does fear sound like? What does anger sound like for this project, for this person? And then once we have that, then we can kind of get into scoring the movie.
Is it tough to get that feedback from a director when you've sent something in that presumably you're like invested in and it's something that's come out of you and they're like, yeah, I'm just not feeling it? Like, is that difficult?
I mean, it can be. I think for me, it depends on the director. This goes back to that thing about, the environment that's being created by that collaborator, because I think this is part of the process when we, fail and figure out how to learn from that failure. And so directors that embrace that and, are still mindful of the fact that we're on a schedule and but embrace that failure and say, like, this isn't right, but here are the things maybe I am liking about it. Here are the reasons why it's not working. Even if nothing's working, having that conversation about why it's not working is so helpful. Just anything we can do to start to learn from it. And there are times where I've done that and the director has articulated to me that I went for the wrong feeling, that really we should be feeling these other subtextual things in this scene that I wasn't aware of, or really we should be looking at it from this person's POV and I did it from a different character's POV. So if I've missed the mark, having a clear conversation about why and how I missed the mark allows me to feel good about that failure and not feel like, because I'm, my job is to serve the picture. And so I'm not, holding onto this piece of music like, no, it has to be this. For me, it's like, okay, great. If I missed the mark, then explain to me how and why, and let's get there so we can serve the movie. I think it becomes most difficult when someone just says like, oh, it's not working for me. Like, try again. And there's no, even if I try out, like, what's going on? Why is it? And they're just like, I don't know. It's not working for me. I think that's when the collaboration becomes tough.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine that's like, well, what do I do now? You know? And I guess that's also better than like someone micromanaging you throughout the process as well. You don't want that either.
Yeah, it's a tough balance for sure. Like, I don't envy, being that director that has to trust the process of collaboration.
So are you left alone quite a lot to do your thing? And are there sort of milestones where you go in and go back to the director, sorry, okay, I've done this, or is it scene by scene, or is it different every time?
It's somewhat different, but lately I've been trying my best to establish a workflow and a process that I feel really good about, and that also can establish consistency on the side of the director. So for me, I'll usually set up, if we're close to sharing the movie or close to finishing the movie, we'll meet about every week, and I'll have something to present for them every week. If it's really early on, we might meet every couple of weeks or every few weeks. And fortunately, in the beginning, I'll have a conversation with the director about, and often the editor, about where they want me to get started. Like, is there a point in the movie where they're like, we either need music here, we're suffering without music here, or we're really excited about this part, or this part is going to be really challenging. And that kind of helps me figure out where to start. But often the directors and collaborators I work with are encouraging of me just responding to wherever I want to start. And so for me, I usually wait until I find a part in the movie that either speaks to me so viscerally that the music is pretty obvious in my mind, like how I want to approach it, and or a moment that feels like it's so integral to this character or this thematic idea in the movie that's going to be very fruitful to start with, so that it can then help inform other spots. And so I might start with this really central scene between these two characters that will establish a theme or a couple of themes that I can then go and, jump around the movie and start to see how that theme works. So I often like to jump around a bit, but work thematically, so that we can start to see, okay, every time we're talking about this character or this idea, this is the theme that's going to happen. How do we feel about the progression of that? And will it, pay off in the end of it? And then doing that with a bunch of the different themes and then starting to piece it together feels like the way that I generally like to work.
And do you ever throw like a real left field option in there, like something complete, maybe for Bridgerton or Green Book or something like that, where it's a period piece and maybe you bring in like a contemporary sound or something like that? I don't know. This isn't phrased as a question really, but what are your thoughts on that?
That's usually the first place I start, because for me, I'm like, we don't have much time, and it's always best to start with like the more wild ideas, to just throw paint at the wall and see if this is going to work. And if it's not going to work, then, that allows it. It's always easier to kind of like pull back than to do a safer approach and then, get down the line. And then all of a sudden somebody's like, did we ever try anything unorthodox or unusual? So for Bridgerton, that's a great example where they told me they wanted this to feel modern and to feel like a surprising take on this period piece and all of that. And so the first piece of music I wrote was, I took like classical instrumentation and orchestration and then chopped it up like samples and made samples out of it, and then made like a hip hop beat for I scored this ball, and I made this like, club type track with orchestral parts. And the director was like, no, that's definitely not it. I think that again was helpful, because then we talked about why, and that it felt too modern, and it felt like, because it was so modern against the period piece, it actually felt like something we've seen before, because there's been a lot of that where there's like really, really modern stuff on period pieces. And then I tried writing very much in the style and then producing it in a way that felt a little bit more modern, but that just kind of translated as it being of the period. So definitely was a bit of trial and error before we found the sound for Bridgerton, and I appreciate again having that trust that I'm trying this wild different thing purposefully, knowing that we can always come back to something else. So it's great when a director or a showrunner in that instance doesn't get fearful when they hear that first piece of music that totally isn't right, and they're like, we have to find somebody else, that when they encourage that failure for us to find something that works. It makes a great collaborative environment.
Yeah, that really does speak to that importance of collaboration and trusting in, the people that you're working with.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that, your job in this instance is to serve the piece. How different is that to when you're just composing sort of for its own sake, right? And you're just composing for like an album or whatever, for something for yourself. Is that a completely different mind shift?
Not really, because I still, for me, come up with some sort of idea that I'm aiming to paint or score musically. Like I'll either think of an actual storyline, like I wrote a horn concerto for the LA Phil, and I wrote a short story and then pulled some imagery that felt like that short story was about a hunter. And so the whole time, it just helped me so that whenever I was stuck, I could always go, well, what's happening in the story right now? Like, what perspective am I looking from? Like, what am I supposed to feel? And that always is my North Star. And so I think for me, that's kind of always been the process where I'm thinking of expressing a specific idea or emotion, and I can always go back to that whenever I feel a bit lost. And then for me, it just makes what I'm writing feel intentional and purposeful, because otherwise it can be very easy to write for, the mental, theoretical side of my brain that just is excited about some cool musical idea, or, but that just feels like it's less purposeful in terms of like sharing this art with other people that might be able to feel something deeper. To me, for that, it's helpful to have an emotional North Star.
And how much of that is literally restricting options? Because now with Pro Tools or whatever, you can have 300 tracks, you have virtual instruments of every instrument on the planet, like you can literally do anything, anytime, right? It's liberating, but it's also overwhelming having that freedom, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, I think it's so helpful for me to have that restricting thing, that clarity. It distills all of these options and possibilities into something that is super specific. And that's, really helpful for me.
Yeah. Okay, so sharp left turn. You worked with Aretha Franklin, right?
Well, so I had a relationship with her. I played for like birthday parties and Christmas parties, and had like a strong relationship with her. And I played at her getting to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and stuff like that. But I actually never worked directly with her.
Right.
But we had a long friendship, even, I would call it. Yeah.
I mean, I just want to hear about what that was like. I don't have a question. What's it like being around Aretha Franklin?
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, she's such a presence, and but she also was such a student, which I think was so amazing. That's kind of what connected us in the beginning. Like, she heard me play at the Monk competition, and she came to the semifinals. She was getting an award, like a Lifetime Achievement Award, at the finals. And she came to the semifinals to hear all the pianists that were competing. And after I finished playing, I was walking backstage and somebody was like, do you mind meeting someone? And I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. And as we're going out to the front, they're like, it's Aretha Franklin we're about to meet. And I remember being super speechless and talking to her in the lobby of this performance hall. And she was like, yeah, you were very good. And, I'd love to stay in touch. Can I have your number? And she went on to tell people that I was her favorite, and she hoped that I won and all that. And so I'd say maybe like a week or so after the competition, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. And I was in the car on the way to a gig. And I'm on the phone to this woman, is like, so what'd you think of the competition? And I was like, it was great. Like, I'm glad I won. I feel thankful. But yeah, and in my head, I was like, who is this person? And she was like, yeah, well, do you know what you're going to do with your career? And then at some point she said something like, well, if you're not satisfied with the record label that you're on from the competition, we could always talk about you being on Aretha Records. And I was like, wait, I'm talking to Aretha Franklin right now. My whole demeanor changed, and luckily I hadn't said anything embarrassing up to that point. But that first manager I had came from her. Like, in that conversation, she was like, if you don't have a manager, your first manager should be like your publicist. And my publicist, I think, would make a great manager for you. So you should talk to Tracy Jordan. She should be your manager. And then again, she just would ask me to play for these events for her. Every now and then she would call me to ask me just what I was working on, what I was practicing, what pianist I was really into, just because she was always trying to get better at the piano. She really loved pianists and talking to pianists about the piano. And so we had a lot of conversations about different exercises I was working on or people I was checking out. And we talked a lot about the possibility of me playing with her or opening up for her or something like that. And that never came to fruition. But along the way, it was definitely a fun relationship.
Yeah. I mean, she's a hell of a piano player too, right? She was amazing.
Yeah, exactly. I think people forget that, or at least I did until, I went back and listened to all those records and focused on her piano playing. And it was pretty phenomenal.
Were you at the show, I forget which one it was, where she came on in the fur coat and she took the fur coat off and she played, I think, Natural Woman? I think she played I think that was the song that she played. But I was like, man, she's an amazing piano player. Like, I didn't even know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I'm like, I feel like that's every show. She has a fur coat.
Yeah. Probably doesn't narrow it down. Yeah. So, we're sort of jumping around a bit here, but can you talk about what it feels like to go into a movie theater and to watch it with your score playing? It must be a pretty overwhelming feeling, or I guess you're used to it now, but I mean, it must be quite a rewarding sensation.
Yeah, totally. I think I never get used to it because what's always so fascinating to me is watching a movie with an audience and seeing an audience react to something all together and seeing how the music is, hopefully helping that reaction and that feeling. And so for me, that point always reminds me of why I wanted to do this when I was a kid and what made me fall in love with this medium. Yeah, and it never gets old, at least, not right now.
I watched Anthem last night and I loved it. I'm really excited to talk to you about it. So how did the concept come about? And just for listeners who are unaware, can you just briefly explain what the concept is for the film?
Yeah, so the film follows myself and a producer named Dahi. He's an incredible producer that produced for Kendrick Lamar and Madonna and all these huge artists. And we go on a road trip to all these different musical locations in the country to investigate the American sound and the history of American music, to try and write a piece of music that can represent the country almost as an anthem, which is where the title comes from. And the idea really sprung from a conversation I had with Pete Nix, the director. He came to me years ago talking about wanting to explore the national anthem. And around the time that he and I met, I had also worked on another project this art installation that explored the anthem. And so he and I were talking about how fascinating it was that, this piece of music that we all know as the sound of our country and this, very nationalistic piece of music is actually like a British song. And so it was just so fascinating to me that this thing that feels very American is not at all in terms of the history of it. And that Francis Scott Key wrote this poem to a British drinking song, essentially. And what would it sound like to reimagine the anthem in today's time, not only taking into account just what our world looks like, the people here and the experiences here, but also musically, just given that we are a country that is so influential musically in the world. Can we write a piece of music that celebrates that American sound, essentially? And so, Pete and I talked about that a few years before we even started really producing the project. And then it just he really just stuck with it. And eventually it came to Hulu and Disney, and they really helped us put it together. And then we filmed it a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it was fascinating. Obviously, I say obviously, but I've been in this country long enough to know that something like that is very charged emotionally, politically, socially. And it struck me that it spoke to a culture of because something is familiar, it can't change. There's a lot of, it's been the same for so long, we can't possibly change it. That sort of tyranny of familiarity. And so you even discussing the idea, well, maybe we don't have to have this anthem. Maybe this isn't something that it has to be the same forevermore, was challenging for a lot of the people that you spoke to. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting how much the song has become a symbol. And also, like you said, people are just very uncomfortable with change. I mean, I think about these things as being similar to like family dynamics, or even a person. Like Joy Harjo in the film says that she thinks of a country as a person. And when you talk to anybody about changing an aspect of who they are that's been a part of their identity for so long, it's a very painful and scary thing, and most people don't want to do that. And so to do that on a country level, I think the thing is that people fear that if we change it, then like there's so much reflection and questioning about who we are or what we are, and that creates this sense of chaos that is really scary. And so I think having something that no matter what, we just accept as this stationary thing, I think allows us to feel like a bit of safety, And so a lot of people, it's funny, even some of the people that aren't in the film, there are times where we were having conversations in each of these cities. And I remember in one city we were packing up, and the woman that worked at the venue was like, "Oh, I just love the anthem so much. And I don't know why anybody would want to change it." And we were saying, well, some people don't feel that great about it, or some people like get negative feelings when they hear it. And she was like, I just don't understand. Like, when I hear that song, I think about my family. I think about, the people I love. And it was in that conversation that it struck me that this woman actually doesn't love the song. She loves what it makes her feel. She loves the fact that this song makes her think about her family, and she loves her family. And so now her feelings about her family have been projected onto this song. And so, we wrapped up so much, either positive or negative, we've wrapped up so much of our feelings to this piece of music. And I think anybody that has wrapped up something positive with it, changing that might change, or feels like you're coming for, their family in a lot of ways, which this film is really trying to examine that projection and that relationship with this thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you think there's an element of possibly guilt in there as well, that acknowledging that maybe this song isn't perfectly representative of America today? There's a sort of, in admitting that, there's a sort of admission of guilt that maybe America isn't perfect, and that's tied up in that, particularly for people who are privileged who don't want to acknowledge it.
Yeah, I think, and also there's like so much complexity to that. I think it's unfortunate that there's a lot of like generational guilt, or this guilt that like, people don't know what to do with because they have so much complexity with like their own lives and stuff. I think about how much people get mad about the idea of privilege because they examine their own lives and feel like there's so much about it that didn't feel very privileged. And, then it gets difficult to argue with them about like what aspects of their existence, inherently creates privilege, even though they maybe didn't feel like they had that. And so I think the guilt is not really like a clear and clean guilt where they can even acknowledge that, and I think it's also just the fear of, I think about like my own family. Like, every family has something in its past that feels like difficult to acknowledge, and I think that like, especially in my family, there's like things that come out of slavery, or things that come out of like, the unfortunate aspect of how families in this country might come into existence, like that come out of slavery, whether it's like, slave owner with their slave, or just all of that history. And my family, some members of my family don't want to talk about that, because for them it's like, I feel so good right now. I feel so much positive regard for myself, a positive regard for our family, that like acknowledging anything negative feels like it takes me to a place I don't want to go. And I think that's the same on a larger scale with this country, that like people are so fearful that acknowledging something negative is going to take us into a negative direction, that they only want to stay in the positive. But what we know from therapy or like anything is just that you have to acknowledge those things to move forward in a real way, and not have that become this like fractured part of your foundation, And so I think it's just stubbornness that, look how many people don't want to go to therapy because they don't want to talk about the bad things. They don't want to look at the bad things. Or even on social media, we've built this way of communicating around only talking about the positive things, only talking about the good things. And it's definitely changed, with how crazy our country has come. But I think that's also just, it's like the shadow self, I think that when you don't, as an individual, look at the shadow self, like the Jungian idea, like, this shadow side, that side's going to come out whether you like it or not. And so it's helpful to acknowledge it so that you can figure out how to grapple with it before it overtakes you. And I think that's what's happening in our country, is like this shadow self that's existed for the existence of our country is coming out because it has to come out. And so we either are going to talk about it or we're going to suppress it again. And then at some point it's going to come back up again. So it just depends on what we do moving forward. But I think it's a good thing to have these types of conversations about the negative, darker side of things, so we can figure out how to move through the pain of it and hopefully move forward in a better way.
Yeah, 100%. And coming out of trauma of any kind, and this is a sort of collective trauma in this country of, everything that's happened and continues to happen, those initial stages are not painless, right? They're difficult and they're challenging, and it can feel like things going backwards before they move forward. But, was it better 10, 15 years ago when we weren't having these conversations, even though it's difficult and it's maybe triggering, for want of a better word, for people on the left, the right, the center, politically? Yeah,
definitely. And I think, that's something else that attracted me to movies, is the psychological exploration that's happening when you watch a movie. And the hero's journey is literally about going into that dark side and grappling with it and coming out, or sometimes tragically not coming out on the other side. And I think that's a lot of what happens on this larger scale with us as a country, is like we're on a hero's journey, and we have to kind of battle these demons. And like you said, it's definitely there's always a darkest point in that journey that is not very comfortable and very difficult. And the aim, though, always is to come out of that embracing this learned new part of self on the other side of the journey. And I hope that we recognize that as a country, so that we can actually aim for that, as opposed to continuing to have a more tragic hero's journey. When you look at the journeys that maybe don't figure out how to deal with this other side.
Yeah, absolutely. Pivoting slightly, I'd never heard Jose Feliciano's version of the Star Spangled Banner before, and it was beautiful. Yeah, and it had such a negative reaction. Were you familiar with it?
Yeah, I actually hadn't heard that version before this project. I was familiar with some of the other some of the other moments where people have deviated and that wasn't received so well. But that one, like you said, really surprised me too, because it felt so beautiful. I think it's also like, that one reminded me a lot of the moments where you go to a concert and somebody's going to play their hit song and they change the way that it sounds. And people get very frustrated by it because there's this sense of ownership over this music that they feel like, and so much of the reason they're coming to that show is to be able to sing that song. And if they can't sing with you, it's infuriating. It feels frustrating that they can't like sing along. And that's one where I thought about the fact that like maybe people are, there's a lot of reasons why they're upset, and some that don't make sense to me in terms of like, I feel like people get upset when someone of a certain race does that. But I think one of the biggest things is like, no matter what the person looks like, you change the song and the people can't sing along to it, they get upset by that, and I think that one really stood out to me because it's such a beautiful emotional rendition of it, but it forces the people there to like sit and listen, and that's not what they come to a baseball game to do. They want to feel the familiarity of it.
It was very striking to watch that. I was like, oh wow, I'd never heard it done like that before, and I'd never heard his performance. I'm very familiar with Jimi Hendrix's version because I'm a massive Jimi Hendrix nerd, and you know his version at Woodstock. That can't have been cheap to license that. But I really appreciate you putting that in.
yeah, for sure. And that was surprising to me that I didn't realize that he had performed that song a lot of times before and after the Woodstock. Like that was kind of like the peak of this journey of the song, of his journey with that song. Like he actually was performing at a lot of live events and live concerts, and then that just happens to be one of them, but one of the greatest by far, I'd say.
Yeah, it was phenomenal. And there was a moment in the film where there was a bit of a, it wasn't like a full-on argument, but there was a little tension between the country singer. I'm sorry, I forget her name.
Charity Bowers.
Yeah. Can you elaborate on that moment?
Yeah, exactly. So, basically, in the beginning of the film, it starts off with Dahi and I taking on this task, and over the course of the project, even outside of filming, we talked with Pete a lot about the fact that we need to have a team do this and write the song together. And so we ended up collecting some of these artists that we met along the journey to form this writer's room with a handful of singers. But part of our intention in creating each of the conversation groups in each of the city was to find people that have differing opinions about the anthem. And a big part of that is just because Pete, as a filmmaker, which is one of the only reasons why I said yes to this, is because Pete, as a filmmaker, is incredible at approaching a very divisive, difficult subject matter in an unbiased, purely objective way, or as objective as possible. Like he's a true verite filmmaker where he's trying to present every viewpoint on something on equal footing and not have it feel like this is the right answer, essentially. And so, I think that with this, he talked from the very beginning about us creating rooms where you had people that felt very different feelings, and the hope of the film is to still be able to have some sort of conversation through that, still work through these differing opinions through conversation. And so even in the creation of this writer's room for the song, we pulled purposely people that had differing opinions, especially because if you're going to write a piece of music about the country, you have to have as many viewpoints in the room as possible. I mean, we talked about the fact that we're very aware of the fact that there are so many viewpoints that weren't represented in that space because we only had a handful of people. But even in that, wanting to have people that have differing viewpoints. And so, yeah, there's inevitably going to be a moment like there was with Charity and Ladonia where, they have totally different experiences in this country. Like Charity comes from a history of pride in this country. Her family served in the military. She has a love for the anthem. Like she has a deep love for this country and what it means to her and what it means to her family and what they've fought for. And Cecilia has a totally different idea of what it means to fight in this country and the fact that she and her family have never felt accepted in this country. And for her, she really believes in the idea that, we shouldn't even have borders, like globally, there shouldn't be anything as borders and, all of that. And so having those two viewpoints in the room are definitely going and trying to write a song together, was going to inevitably lead to people disagreeing. And I think that that's what was so, interesting about this experiment to write this song in this way is, can you have those differing viewpoints and still create something? And that's really on a micro level, like the question to the country, like, can we have these differing viewpoints and still create something beautiful in terms of like what this country is? So yeah, I'm glad that I appreciate them for being willing and vulnerable enough to not only join, knowing that there are people with such strongly different opposing viewpoints, on the project and on the team with them, but also to still push through that and try to make something and not walk away at that point of difficulty.
Yeah, I mean, that must have been a concern for you, right? that this didn't necessarily end in a beautiful collaboration and someone didn't end up storming out, or that must have been worrying, right?
Yeah, for me, it wasn't worrying. For me, the part that I said yes to this because I was interested in the experiment of it. Like to me, this was like like, can this happen? Like, I wasn't going into it like, oh, we have to do this. Like, we have to figure out a way to write this piece of music. Like, there's a part of me that was like, this might all like fall apart. And then that would also be an interesting, like, showcase of how this process happened. So I walked into it very open to that. And so that also allowed us to not, to let these people feel like they had the freedom to continue on or to walk away if they wanted to. I think it was expressing to them the importance of doing this all together, but at the same time, like, that's such an honest depiction of how someone might feel at this time in our country. And so that's the case, then that'd be the case, and that would have been a different ending to the film that would have been just as valid as us actually writing a song all together. And so, I'm glad that we were able to, just in the same way that, like, in the hero's journey, I am hopeful that, we as a country continue to work through those difficulties to still make something, but there's also a version of it where that doesn't happen. So, I think it's a good thing that happened in the movie, but I wasn't afraid of the other alternative, because that's always a possibility.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I've got to let you go, but before I do, I'd love to hear any advice that you have for any young composers out there wanting to get into the kind of work that you do. Obviously, it's a bit of a different world now, 2023. People starting out now may not have the same experience that you did growing up and growing into this career. What would you advise for those looking to get into this kind of work?
Yeah, I would definitely advise studying everything possible and being obsessed with craft, and that being, the actual craft of composing or producing and composing in whatever style or genre that moves you, and following that. I feel excited about the time we're in now, where you don't have to be this expert at orchestration to be a film composer. You can be, an incredible hip hop producer and be a film composer. You can be an incredible rock musician and be a film composer. So really, it's just about continuing to hone your craft, whatever that is, but also really learning as much as possible about the art of film composing as it relates to expressing emotion and story through music. And then the other thing I'd say is just to get to know yourself, because that is the part that feels most difficult in this industry. Is, there's so many times where you're interacting with failure, or you're interacting with, people saying no, or things that just don't really feel good in the process of creation. And that reverberates internally, where something is going to come up that makes you feel badly about yourself, or makes you feel overly prideful, or whatever it is. And so getting to know that way that your mind processes these difficult moments, so that you can move through those moments with as much grace as possible.
Well, perfect ending to the pod. Thanks so much. I really appreciate talking to you today. I love the movie, and fantastic advice to end there for those looking to get into this. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Special thanks, of course, to Kris Bowers. You can check out Anthem on Hulu. And also, if you'd like to follow us on social media, we're Soundstage Insider on Instagram and Soundstage In on Twitter. Don't forget to also check out Backstage's In the Envelope podcast, which is our sister podcast. And yeah, that's pretty much it for today. So have a great week, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.